Thank you so much for inviting me here. I think from the onset, I must point out that I'm not a practitioner. Like Toro said, I graduated last year. But what I can try and do is to share with you some of the research that I've been doing over the past couple of years, and in particular, a particular research project that I've just initiated here. I'll begin by stating what the presentation will be about. In the first part, I'll talk about the current model of affordable housing in Mumbai, which is a case of profit over people. It's actually where we use the private sector to build affordable housing, and it's completely failed to actually respond to issues of informality. And that will lead me to the second part, which will be about trying to spend more time and energy in actually mapping the slums of Mumbai and even elsewhere, because I think there's several types and typologies that exist which we don't actually talk about enough. And I'll illustrate this in the third part with one slum that I've just mapped and show you where the research is heading. So to give you an idea of where Mumbai is and the city, it's a city of extreme contrast. It's a city of about 22 million people, of which about 12 million actually live in informal settlements. But it's also India's financial capital, so that's the dichotomy. It's also a city of incredible densities. If you look at this map, it actually accommodates more people than all of the Netherlands at a density of something like 10 times of what we have here. So as a result of which you end up with landscapes like this, which are completely contradictory and schizophrenic, where you have the rich and the poor, the formal and the informal sort of colliding and trying to occupy the same space. But what was interesting to me was to try and understand how Mumbai has grown over the past 400 years. And these are maps that I made. And essentially we begin to see that informal settlements are a problem or an issue only from the 1950s onwards. And it's only after 1990, when India opened up its economy, that we began to see a real surge in the rise of informal settlements. And what was also important for me was to understand what our different attitudes have been over the past 50 or 60 years and compare that with what was happening even elsewhere in the world. And I think in most places in the developing world, most governments were first in the stage of denial and demolition. At best, what they would do is to build public housing on the outskirts of cities, and they still do that. And in Mumbai, that translated into the Slum Clearance Act of 1956. But soon enough in the 70s, they realized that this doesn't work, and they moved into an era of improvement, and this resulted in the Slum Improvement Act of 1971. But what's to me interesting is that over the past 15 or 20 years, we're beginning to see a lot of very exciting models come out of places like South America. But in India, we're still in a phase of redeveloping our slums, or at least in Mumbai. And that's where we use the private sector to actually build housing. And this is all part of a much larger sort of vision to make Mumbai into this world-class city, which no one really knows what it is. But it seems to me that this is what they think a world-class city is. That's Dharavi on the left. If you've seen Slumdog Millionaire, for example, that's the slum you're looking at. And that's what they intend to do with the slum, which is really criminal, because Dharavi is much more than just a place of substandard housing. It's a place full of commerce and industries, and it actually is very vital to Mumbai's economy. Thankfully, that hasn't gone through, but this is what does happen in the city. This is Mumbai's answer to slum rehousing, or rehabilitation as it's called. Essentially, the government is merely a facilitator in the process. They don't actually put in any money. They invite the private developer, and any slum that comes under this scheme is first eradicated completely. All living patterns, all existing communities are demolished, and in their place come these tenements, like in the photograph you just saw, and that's only on 1/3 of the site. And then the remaining 2/3 is given back to the private developer to actually make his profits, which are enormous. And I'll just show you this in two examples in the city, these two different sites, and that's what they look like about 5 or 6 years back, and that's what they look like now. So I think the photographs sort of do the talking. I don't really need to explain how criminal that is. Now also, if you look at densities, essentially what this policy is suggesting is that slums, even though they occupy or they accommodate 60% of the entire city, they occupy only 9% of the land. And essentially what this model is suggesting is that we should now squeeze these people into just 3% and keep the remaining 6% for high-end real estate. So it's not only a question of adding extreme densities on sites that were already very dense, but it's also about not understanding that people require much more than just a place of shelter. They require schools, they require open spaces, hospitals, and this is something that we don't provide. And if they were actually serious about providing these amenities to these people, that's the amount of amenities that they would have to provide. And these are as per laws that already exist in our city. But most of all, it's important to understand that in Mumbai, about 65% of our entire workforce is actually employed in the informal sector. So destroying slums also in a way harms our economy, among many other things. So which leads me to this, which is trying to understand the types and typologies that exist. I think we all know what the UN defines as a slum, and there are several definitions. The Census of India has a different definition. And of course, there are several similar characteristics, but I think that there are also several differences. And for example, in types of construction or standard of living, very often you see slums that are composed of housing which is entirely like this, just bamboo and plastic sheets. And then of course you also see cases where people have managed to put together materials and make a house like this. And then there are different degrees of this standard of living and type of construction. So that's one parameter. I think very importantly, there's also another parameter which is based on function and program. There are slums which are entirely residential in nature, but there are also slums which are a complete mix of housing and commercial spaces and industries, like Dharavi. So while it may seem that all these cities, whether it's Caracas or Mumbai or Rio, we all seem to be sharing the same problems or facing the same problems, the reality is that informal urbanization manifests itself in different contexts in very different ways. And I think the problems of a place like Buenos Aires are actually quite different to the one in Mumbai, because in Buenos Aires you have most of the settlements on the outskirts of the city, whereas in Mumbai you have them elsewhere. So that requires or triggers a different response from us as architects or planners. And also if you look at densities, the densities in Rio, for example, can never be as close to the ones in Mumbai. So while it's interesting to sort of look at models from South America, it's not simply a case of transferring them into Mumbai and expecting it to work. And also if you just look at Mumbai, there are several types that exist, and Marco also pointed out a few of them. Peripheral slums are extremely different from city center slums, are extremely different from urban villages. So they really differ depending on origin, location, size, but also the level of accessibility with the rest of the city and the level of amenities. And I think that there's a lot of information that does exist, whether it's books or whether it's articles in journals that all of us have read. What I'm particularly interested is in mapping the spatial phenomena of slums. That's really going down to the detail of a house and trying to understand the built form of different slums and the level of amenities and densities. And in a way it comes out of books like this which inspired me, which is, for example, How the Other Half Lives was a book written more than a century ago. And what it did was to photograph the slums of New York, and in a way they managed to affect housing policy at the time. So the aims of the research is to map the spatial phenomena, but also to try and address this, what I think is a sort of lack of cross-national comparative studies between different slums in different contexts. And if we map it, we might try and be able to compare what a slum in Mumbai is as compared to a slum in Sao Paulo. And I'll just show you this with this one slum that I did map, which is an extremely exciting site, an interesting site, because it sits in the financial district of Mumbai. That's the World Trade Center. Those two towers, the two white towers, are the World Trade Center, and that's the slum right behind it. And what might seem like the sea of poverty from above is actually at ground level three very distinct communities, including a community of washermen in the bottom right photograph. And what they do is to have this relationship with the formal city around, because the hotels and the restaurants actually send their linen and their clothes to this place to get washed, and they wash it in the open air, dry it, and then send it back in the evening. So one of the first things I did was to map this slum, but not only the slum, but also the entire area that it sits in, to understand its land use, but also to map its accessibility, its infrastructure, and also its amenities. And also what I did see was that these slums also differ when you go into them. So for example, on the outskirts you had houses that are also doubling up as shops, whereas if you go in the interior, you get houses which were, in this case, poorer in construction, with streets more dimly lit, and when you move towards the edge, they were probably at their worst case. And in terms of typologies, there were four very distinct types that I could find in this slum. There were these houses on the edge, like I was saying, that also double up as shops or workspaces. So you have the living room or the living spaces on the top floor, on the ground floor as a shop, and that becomes a source of income, which is extremely important. Or in this case, there was a family that had living spaces but also another shop, and what they did was to rent out their roofs to the other washermen in the community, and that again became a source of income. And I point this out because I think this is what is lacking when we do mass housing in the city. We don't seem to incorporate these elements. Or there were certain structures that were not living spaces at all. They were entirely just workspaces or commercial spaces. And then the more dominant ones were, of course, the ones with residences. So I think what I'm just basically trying to get to is that there are several typologies that exist, and this is actually just one slum. And it's important to actually map these out, because then we can even present this and show this to the general public, but also to governments, to try and stop the sort of housing that they're doing right now, which is this. And just to wrap up, so yeah, that's the slum that I've mapped so far, and I'm mapping these other slums as well. And the idea is to then get together with colleagues from this university and even elsewhere, and with the chair of dwelling, and sort of map slums not only in Mumbai but even in other cities, with the hope that then that helps us get a better overview of the various types and typologies exist. Thank you.